This is what was supposed to be Britain's answer to its worst traffic bottleneck. And this is the reality today. Barely a few cuttings dug, billions already spent, and not a single tunnel boring machine underground. With the Lower Thames Crossing now sitting among the most expensive road projects ever proposed in the UK, the question is simple. How did a single river crossing balloon into a $15 billion problem before construction even properly began? To try and get a clearer picture, I dug through the planning documents, the cost reports, and nearly 2 decades of delays that turned this into one of the most controversial infrastructure stories in modern Britain. Seeing a project this badly needed get stuck like this is just plain frustrating. Cancellation has been floated more than once. But it isn't the likely outcome now that the government has formally approved it. Today, we'll look at why the costs exploded, what's actually being built, and the broader context behind Britain's most expensive tunnel. The need for the crossing was never really in dispute. The Dartford crossing has been the only road crossing of the Thames east of London for more than 60 years, currently handling roughly 160,000 vehicles daily, far beyond what it was ever designed for. Planners have been chasing a solution for decades. An additional Thames crossing downstream from Dartford was first considered in a 1989 government white paper, before being formally recommended for further investigation in a 2002 study examining orbital transport problems around London. The proposal that eventually stuck was ambitious by any measure. The Lower Thames Crossing would consist of a 14.5-mile road linking the A2 and M2 in Kent with the A13 and M25 in Essex, centred on a twin-bore tunnel under the river between Gravesend and Tilbury that, at 2.6 miles long, would become the longest road tunnel in the UK. On paper, the design was genuinely impressive. Each tunnel would carry 3 lanes of traffic with a 70 miles per hour speed limit, and roughly 80% of the route would run through tunnels, cuttings, or embankments to minimize its visual impact on the surrounding landscape. Environmental mitigation was baked in from the start too. The project promised 6 times more green space than the road itself, with plans for over 1 million additional trees, new community woodland, 2 new riverside parks, and 7 green bridges to give wildlife safer crossing points. It was, by every official description, meant to be Britain's greenest major road scheme. But somewhere between the first proposal and an actual shovel in the ground, the project turned into a textbook example of planning paralysis. The cost trajectory alone tells the story. Initially expected to cost between £5.3 and £6.8 billion, the price climbed steadily as Britain's planning system and repeated delays drove the bill upward. By November 2022, the expected cost had officially risen to £9 billion, and by late 2025, the estimate had risen again to between 10.6 and almost £11 billion. At current projections, the Lower Thames Crossing is expected to cost more per mile than many sections of HS2, an extraordinary figure for a road project rather than a high-speed railway. So, where did all that money actually go before a single tunnel boring machine had even been ordered? Largely into paperwork. National Highways had already spent £267 million on the planning application alone, a figure larger than the total construction cost of some tunnel projects completed elsewhere in the world. The application itself became almost a punchline in UK infrastructure circles. National Highways spent nearly £300 million and 7 years developing the Development Consent Order, producing what was reported as the largest DCO application ever submitted, running to nearly 360,000 pages. Even accounting for some media exaggeration around that page count, the scale of the bureaucratic effort was staggering for a project that, by 2024, still hadn't broken ground. The approval process itself became a case study in repeated postponement. A planning application was initially submitted in 2020 before being withdrawn entirely, with a new application following in November 2022. What was meant to be an 18-month review dragged on for years. A decision originally due on June 20th, 2024 was delayed partly because of the July 2024 general election and partly because ministers said they needed more time to consider the scheme. A further postponement was announced that October before the crossing was finally approved in March 2025. Land acquisition added its own controversy along the way, with data later showing National Highways had bought dozens of homes along the route, some of them years before the project had even received formal consent, fueling criticism from some campaigners that the project was gathering momentum before the public consultation process had fully run its course. Funding became its own unresolved puzzle. Unlike a straightforward public works scheme, the government tried to thread a needle between taxpayer money and private investment. The crossing's main funding is expected to come from £3.1 billion of public money alongside £7.5 billion from the private sector, with an extra £174 million allocated in June 2026, specifically to fund public works at both ends of the tunnel. Government officials have leaned on that private sector hope publicly. Chancellor Rachel Reeves indicated the private sector could help deliver infrastructure the country desperately needs, though the specific funding model for the bulk of the project still hadn't been finalised by the time of approval. Even after 16 years of delays, the formal green light came with its own asterisks. Transport Secretary Heidi Alexander granted the development consent order on March 25th, 2025, after 16 years of planning and £1.2 billion already spent on development before a single major construction contract had broken ground. Oversight of the project kept shifting too. The Department for Transport assumed a greater role in overseeing the project's finances as political scrutiny of the scheme intensified. And by December 2025, a DFT director had formally been appointed to lead the project as its senior responsible owner, a sign of just how politically sensitive the project's finances had become. Construction contracts, at least, are now real and moving. Balfour Beatty, Skanska, and a Boyden-Murphy joint venture are the leading contractors, with construction expected to begin in 2026 and continue into the early 2030s. With the latest projections pointing to completion around 2034. The work has been split into clear pieces. Balfour Beatty secured a £1.2 billion contract in January 2023 to build 10 miles of highway connecting the M25 to the Northern Tunnel entrance. Skanska won a £450 million contract in July 2023 for roads on the southern Kent side, and a Boyden-Murphy joint venture won the £1.3 billion tunnels and approaches contract in December 2023. Even the tunnelling method reflects an attempt to claw back some cost efficiency. The consortium plans to use a single tunnel boring machine for both bores, turning it around and reusing it after completing the first tunnel rather than running two machines simultaneously. Critics, though, haven't let up on whether any of this represents good value. The scheme was at one point officially labelled low value for money by assessors, even as it continued moving through the planning process. Years of delay also meant planned roadwork kept slipping further down the pipeline, with watchdogs flagging that the project repeatedly fell behind its own spending and delivery targets. Campaigners have also pointed to alternatives that never got serious traction, with supporters arguing that rail-based alternatives could have delivered significant freight benefits at a fraction of the cost. One proposed rail-based alternative, a new cross-river rail link at Dartford, was estimated to cost just £2 to £2.5 billion. Opponents of the scheme have also pointed abroad for comparison, though the projects in question aren't directly comparable given differences in geology, regulatory regimes, and project scope. Critics frequently note that Norway completed its 9.2-mile Eiksund undersea tunnel back in 2008 for around £109 million, or roughly £11.8 million per mile, a figure dramatically lower than what Britain has already spent purely on planning paperwork for the Lower Thames Crossing. Defenders of the UK project counter that British geology, environmental protections, and urban density make such comparisons unfair, even if the gap remains striking. So, where does that leave Britain's most expensive road tunnel? approved, funded on paper, and finally moving toward real construction. But only after burning through more than £1 billion and 16 years just getting permission to start. The crossing will almost certainly get built. The need for it was never the problem. Congestion at Dartford is real and only getting worse. The problem was a planning system that turned a roughly £6 billion road project into one nearing £11 billion before a single tunnel boring machine had even been switched on. For a country that wants to be seen as a place where infrastructure gets built efficiently, the Lower Thames Crossing stands as a warning of what happens when bureaucracy begins to rival the cost of actually building things. Thanks for watching, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.